so as everybody flips to the characterization handout that you have. So we just talked about memorization, and we talked about the different types of techniques that memorization has. Now, with interpretive events, sometimes I find it easier to sort of memorize in characterization. Because a lot of times, as Sarah was talking about doing those big movements where you memorize to sort of get you out of that rut of staying the same way, sometimes it's nice to get into that rut, but only if it's in your actual characterization. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll kind of do memorization and characterization at the same time, so that way I can start getting into my character and then memorizing it in character instead of having to do it on top. That's just what works for me. You guys can do whatever works for you guys, but I found that that's really helpful to just get it memorized in character instead of trying to add on top of your memorization afterwards. So next we're going to talk about characterization, and there are several different ways and different methods and different steps to fully characterizing your character. So the first thing that you have to do is sort of create the foundation before you actually go about physically and vocally characterizing your character. You have to know who your character is. So in order to adequately embody your characters, you must analyze them. Your physical and vocal characterization will derive from your character's personality, circumstances, experiences, and motivations. So just really analyzing your character, knowing where your character came from, how old your character is, what your character looks like, what did your character just do, what is your character about to do, how does your character feel. All of those questions are really important to sort of answer before you go into physically characterizing, because what you feel on the inside is more often than not displayed on the outside. And knowing just who your character is will really help you know how to characterize your character and what to do in order to physically and vocally characterize your character. So you want each character in your piece to be extremely distinct. Now this is very, very important. Because you're just physically characterizing your character and vocally characterizing your character, you're not saying Sally says and then popping into Sally. You're just popping into Sally. You really want to make sure each character is distinct so the judges don't get confused or mixed up. Now, I find that a lot of times in cartoon acting or when you're acting out animals, it's really easy to be distinct because they have very obvious characteristics. When you do more detailed, realistic acting, that's when all the little details come in, and that's when this foundation is really, really important. So the first thing you're going to look at in the foundation is the emotional characteristics of your character. So what are your characters' relationships? What are your characters' relationships with families, friends? Does your character have an enemy? All these things are important in knowing who your character is and how your character interacts with the other characters in your interpretive piece. And then how does your character feel about those relationships? Is your character in love? Does your character have indifference or anger or frustration? And all of those things will sort of come about and come out as you characterize your character. So these are all good questions, and a lot of these next slides are going to be formatted in questions, but these are good questions to ask yourself and answer when you're analyzing each and every one of your characters. And does this change? A lot of times throughout the story, your character's relationships with people will change. They'll fall in love with somebody, or they'll make an enemy, or something will come together. A lot of times this changes, sometimes it doesn't, but recognizing that will help you to sort of change your characterization and change your acting throughout the piece, but you need to know that beforehand in order to do it. What are your character's motivations? What does your character want in life, in the scene? Now, a lot of times this ties directly with that conflict that you chose in the beginning. Sally wants her candy, and Tom does not want to lose his job. A lot of times the motivations tie in directly with how you cut your piece as well. So what motivates your character? Is it passion, revenge? Do they feel like they have some sort of duty to fulfill? Or is it their faith? Knowing these things will really help you understand your story as a whole and understand where your character is going. Because that motivation and your characters are what drive that story forward. And does this motivation, again, change within the story? Do they not fall in love with somebody? Do they get angry, or do they lose their faith? Something like that. Does it change throughout the story? And knowing that will help you physically characterize, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm sure right now that doesn't really make much sense. But keeping on with the emotional characteristics, why hasn't your character achieved his or her goals? Again, this ties directly with that conflict. It's will blank blank. Something is happening in order to keep that character from achieving that blank blank now. And sort of keeping in mind and knowing what is keeping your character from achieving his or her goals will help you understand your character. And the reason why knowing your actual character and not just physically embodying them is important is because it'll change the way that you act. It'll change the way that you physically embody your character, and it'll help you become your character instead of just acting it out. And a lot of times judges can tell the difference between you just saying the lines and sort of acting a character and actually really sort of becoming the character and knowing the character. And that's what really sets you apart from being maybe the last half of the ranking and the top half of the ranking is your characterization and how detailed it is. And at the end of your piece, what does your character learn? Does he or she change? Now, in my DI last year, I know I've used this a lot as an example, but my character grew and changed throughout the story. In the middle of the story, she was very fearful, she was angry, but at the very end of the story, she had peace and she had forgiveness. And that changed the way that I portrayed my character physically, and it changed the demeanor of my character, and it made it very realistic because I'd already thought about this and I already knew what was happening ahead of time. So the next thing you want to know about your character before you physically embody it is actually the physical attributes of your character. How old is your character? How much does he or she weigh? How tall is he or she? And does she have any disabilities? So if I'm a 6'2" man, that'll change the way that I stand. It'll change the way that I look at people. If I'm a 6'2" man and I'm talking to a little girl, I'm going to look down. I'm going to change the way that I stand because I'm super tall. If I'm playing a little kid, I'm going to be looking up and I'm going to be a lot smaller in persona. Knowing just the height or the weight of somebody will help you physically embody them. Also looking at those disabilities, my monologue last year, I portrayed a girl with cerebral palsy. Now the story wouldn't make any sense if I didn't know that she actually had cerebral palsy and didn't actually physically characterize it. So just knowing things like that is very helpful when you go to physically characterize. And also, how does your character walk, talk, smile, laugh, and cry? A lot of times, especially in DIs, you want to figure out how your character cries because you're going to try and make your character cry a lot. But just everybody has a different way of walking. Everybody has a different way of talking. And everybody has a different way of sneezing or smiling. And making those things selected to your specific character will really bring your character to life. If you work on all those little details, it'll really bring that character to life and make that character believable. And is your character attractive or ugly? Is your character quirky? Does he or she smell? How do people react to your character? Trying to know all of those different things about your character, how people react, how your character feels, will really help the physical characterization become easier, and also the acting, which we'll talk about later, that'll become easier too because you just know your character. And how would your character identify his or herself? Is your character a Christian? Is your character a Frenchman? In my example, my DI, my character was a Tutsi, and my piece was about racism, so the identity had a big part in there. So just knowing the basics about your character and who your character is gives you a strong foundation for you to then move on to the physical characterization. But this is a big step that you do not want to go over, you do not want to just breeze over. You really want to take time to get to know your character, who your character is, how your character feels, before you just jump straight into physically characterizing your character. Now, another part of what makes your character, or who that person is the setting that they're placed in. What stage of life is your character in? Is your character 3 years old? Is your character an orphan? Is your character suffering from a midlife crisis? All those things will just change the way that you act and physically perform. What time period in history is your character in? Is your character in the Renaissance, the Civil War? Is it modern times? Is it ancient times? All those things will change the way that you act because, as we can see in the social areas and climate, that'll also change the way that you perform as well. If I am a woman in the 1800s, I'm going to maybe stand differently. I'm going to maybe talk differently. I might have an accent. All those things will change based on the social climate and the time period of your character. And what has your character done in his recent past? What is your character doing right now? And what is your character about to do? Why are you telling the story? Why is your character about to say the line that your character is just going to say? Why is your character in the position that you're telling the story right now? Answering those questions are very important because it gives you an in-depth understanding of your character.